The grey-haired nurse didn't flinch when the overhead speaker crackled at 2,247 hours. Just another night at Oak Creek Memorial. Just another voice calling for someone else. Margaret Walsh had learned 11 years ago that flinching was a luxury she couldn't afford. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical song above her head as she restocked the crash cart in Bay 7, her hands moving through the familiar rhythm, airway equipment, for supplies, medications arranged in the precise order muscle memory had carved into her bones. Her badge read M. Walsh, RN, in faded blue letters. Nobody on this floor knew what the M stood for. Nobody had asked in a long time. The antiseptic smell of the hospital corridor filled her nostrils as she pulled the cart toward the storage closet. 11 years of this smell. 11 years of blue scrubs and fluorescent hum and the sound of her own breathing, steady and controlled, the way she'd trained it to be. The faded unit patch was still there, sewn inside her jacket lining where nobody could see it. She touched it sometimes when passing the trauma bay, a nervous habit she couldn't break, a reminder of the person she wasn't allowed to be anymore. The embroidered insignia felt rough under her fingertips through the fabric. Eagle, anchor, trident. She pulled her hand away and kept moving. That was when the ER doors burst open. Not a routine arrival. The rotor wash from something outside, helicopter, maybe, or the wind just before the storm rolled in. 3 paramedics pushing a gurney at speed. One of them shouting vitals she didn't hear over the sudden pressure change in her chest. Margaret turned toward the noise, clipboard in one hand, and her vision found him in that first second, the way a compass finds north. Commander James Harding. Blind. Deteriorating. Shrapnel still lodged near his spine after all these years. His face was thinner than she remembered from Ramadi, his left eye scarred shut, but his jaw was the same. That jaw that had jutted forward with righteous certainty when he'd testified against her. That jaw that had cost her everything. The clipboard fell from her fingers. It hit the linoleum with a sound like a gunshot. Muscle memory took over. She didn't move toward him. She turned away. Her hands steadied themselves against the crash cart. 1 breath. 2. The kind of calm that comes from having already survived the worst had taught her how to swallow her own reactions whole, to push everything down into the vault where it couldn't escape and betray her. She kept her back to the gurney as it wheeled past, kept her eyes on the supply shelf in front of her, kept her jaw locked so tight that her teeth ached. Nobody else would have caught it. A split-second freeze. A moment where her professional mask had slipped like a scratched windshield. But Dr. Caldwell, who had just finished a chart at the nursing station 15 feet away, had been looking directly at her when it happened. The memory came anyway, whether she wanted it or not. Ramadi. 2009, the courthouse, not really a courthouse, a command tent with a table and folding chairs and the weight of a prosecution that nobody wanted to win but everybody was going to execute anyway. She'd been Major Margaret Walsh then, not just Margaret, not just a nurse. Combat Surgical Operations Officer. 16 years of service. 2 tours in theater. 67 lives saved in field conditions. That was the record. That was the woman they'd court-martialed for treason she didn't commit. Commander Harding had sat across from her and sworn under oath that she'd mishandled classified intelligence, that she'd been a security risk, that her presence had compromised operations. He'd wept real tears when he said it. She remembered that. She remembered his voice cracking when he said she was unfit for command, unfit to serve, and later, when the real traitor was exposed and she was promoted and officially exonerated, she remembered being told very quietly that her new identity was permanent. Her old self was dead. If she ever surfaced again, if she ever tried to reclaim her commission, if she ever even mentioned Ramadi in casual conversation, the entire operation would be exposed. The witness protection would terminate. The retirement they'd offered her, $23,000 a year, 10-year contract, renewable, would evaporate. So she'd become a nurse. She'd learned how to walk quietly. How to make herself invisible. How to work night shifts where she wouldn't have to interact with anyone who might know the truth. 11 years of becoming nobody. And now he was here. The paramedic was still listing vitals. Respiratory rate 32 and climbing. Oxygen saturation 91 on 15 liters. Blood pressure 98/62. The voice sounded desperate, practiced, trained. That was the tone of somebody who'd been running with a deteriorating patient for too long. Margaret forced herself to turn back toward the gurney, forced her face into the neutral professional expression she'd perfected over a decade, and watched as Dr. Caldwell strode past the nursing station with his tablet already in hand, already shaking his head before anyone had said a word. "Get him to Bay 3, Caldwell said. Not a question. Not a request. A command that made the nurses scatter like birds, clearing space, pulling equipment, preparing for what was about to become a surgical consult. "Who's the primary?" Nobody answered immediately. That silence was its own kind of language. Margaret watched the paramedics begin to transfer Harding onto the hospital gurney, watched the blind man's head turn toward the sound of her voice before she even realized she'd stepped forward, and she forced herself to stop moving. To become still. To become invisible again. Dr. Caldwell noticed. His eyes flicked in her direction for just long enough that she felt it like a spotlight. Then he looked back at his tablet, but his jaw had shifted. That was the moment he started calculating. That was the moment he began to wonder what had made the quiet grey-haired night shift nurse react to a patient who had just arrived in his hospital. "Get me a baseline," Caldwell said, turning toward Bay 3. "Full workup. Let's find out if this one's even salvageable before we waste resources on a consultation." It wasn't a request. It was a command that said what he was already thinking. The patient in Bay 3 wasn't a person anymore. He was a problem. A liability calculation. Another case that would either resolve quickly or become an operational burden. The paramedics finished the transfer. Harding's voice came then, weaker than she remembered it, different from the confident testimony she'd heard in Ramadi. "Who's there? Someone? I can't see. I can't, the light's too bright, I think, or I'm not seeing it right." A resident appeared, one of the younger ones, nervous energy in every movement. "You're safe. You're in Oak Creek Memorial Hospital. We're going to run some tests, okay? Figure out what we're working with." Caldwell was already turning back toward the nursing station, his attention already shifting to the next problem, the next calculation. But his eyes found her one more time as he passed. That cold clinical assessment. That moment of recognition that something had happened in this hallway that he didn't understand. Yet, Margaret pulled the crash cart back toward the supply closet where she belonged. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was controlled. But beneath her jacket, where the faded unit patch was sewn into the lining, her heart had begun to move in a rhythm that wasn't quite sinus. What happened next would change everything. The overhead paging system crackled at 1,430 hours, and Dr. Caldwell's voice slid through the speakers like oil across water. "Grandma Mags to the nurse's station. Grandma Mags to the nurse's station." The entire surgical floor froze for exactly 1 second. Then the snickers started, younger nurses exchanging glances, a resident covering his mouth, one of the attendings actually turning away to hide a grin. Margaret was in Trauma Bay 3, restocking the defibrillator cart, and she didn't move. Didn't flinch. Didn't let her hands slow down as she aligned the electrode pads in their precise rows. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their mechanical song, indifferent to humiliation. She knew what Dr. Caldwell had done. He'd seen her reaction when Harding arrived, that half-second of recognition before she'd turned away, and now he was dissecting her in real time, using the hospital's communication system as his scalpel. 11 years she'd walked these corridors. 11 years of night shifts and double shifts and holding the dying when no one else would sit with them. 11 years of being nobody. And one man had watched her freeze for a heartbeat, and now the entire floor knew something was wrong. Margaret closed the defibrillator cart and walked toward the nurse's station with the same measured pace she'd used crossing a minefield. Each step deliberate. Each breath controlled. Her ears burned, actually burned, like fire under skin, but her face remained blank, the mask held in place by the same discipline that had kept her alive through 3 tours in Ramadi. The younger nurses watched her pass. She could feel their eyes, curious and cruel in the way of people who'd never had anything taken from them. She'd never corrected them when they called her just a nurse. She'd never explained the scar tissue beneath her scrubs, or the calluses on her hands that came from holding weapons, not bedpans. Dr. Caldwell stood at the station, reviewing a chart, his body language the picture of casual authority. Expensive watch. Tailored white coat. The kind of man who'd never been questioned in his life. "Doctor," Margaret said quietly. "I'm here." He didn't look up. "Excellent. I wanted to inform you personally that your employment here is under review. 11 years is quite a tenure, but tenure isn't the same as competence, is it?" His voice was soft, meant for her ears alone, but Margaret noticed the charge nurse had suddenly become very interested in her computer screen. Caldwell's words hung in the air like a scent, designed to spread, designed to linger. "I've been documenting certain irregularities in your work. Small things. A medication administered at the wrong time. A patient chart incomplete. Nothing dramatic, just patterns. And I think it would be prudent to have HR examine those patterns before they become liabilities." Margaret's jaw tightened, just barely, just enough for the pressure to register in her molars. The pain was information. Always had been. This man was afraid. Not of her competence. Of something else. Something he'd seen in her face that told him she knew. She'd seen his computer screen 3 nights ago. Pharmaceutical rep payments. Surgery reports with altered dates. Names and amounts that didn't align with legitimate billing. He was fragmenting, desperate to preempt whatever he thought she might reveal. "I understand, Doctor," Margaret said, and her voice was absolutely steady, absolutely flat. The voice of someone who'd already survived worse. Caldwell's eyes flicked up to hers for just a moment, and she saw it, the surprise that she wasn't breaking, wasn't defending herself, wasn't cracking under the social pressure he'd engineered. He'd expected tears or anger or defensive babbling. Instead, he got silence and composure. It frustrated him. She could see it in the way his jaw clenched. But there was something else in his expression too, a flicker of calculation, of reassessment. He turned back to his chart without another word, dismissing her like she was nothing. Margaret walked back to Trauma Bay 3, and the Snickers had already died. The floor had settled back into its rhythm, beeping monitors, squeaking shoes on tile, the hiss of air from ventilators. But the damage was done. By the end of the shift, everyone would know that Dr. Caldwell had something against Margaret Walsh. And by morning, the vultures would circle. She didn't have to wait that long. At shift change the next morning, at 0630 hours, Dr. Caldwell walked onto the 4th floor carrying a mop bucket and wheeled cart. The bucket was industrial yellow, marked with faded rust stains, the kind of equipment usually relegated to the basement maintenance staff. He set it down in the middle of the nursing station, directly in front of the arriving day shift. 20 staff members were present. Margaret counted them automatically, a habit from a life where counting headcount was the difference between an ambush and an escape. Caldwell's voice was loud and clear, pitched to carry. "Walsh. You're reassigned effective immediately. Janitorial duties, parking lot levels 1 through 3. Consider this a final warning before termination procedures begin." He handed her the mop with a smile that was all teeth. "I'm sure you're capable of managing basic custodial tasks." The silence that followed wasn't surprised, it was shocked. No one expected this. Public reassignment to janitorial work wasn't standard protocol. It was calculated humiliation, the kind that sent a message to every staff member present: do not associate with this woman, do not advocate for this woman, do not defend this woman. Margaret took the mop with steady hands. She'd held weapons heavier than this. She'd held dying soldiers and kept them talking long enough for the medevac to arrive, and she'd done it while bleeding from a shrapnel wound that had cost her 15 years of her life. She looked at Dr. Caldwell and let one tear escape, just one, controlled, deliberate. Not a cracking composure, but a moment of humanity that would lodge in his brain. She wiped it away without breaking eye contact, and her voice came out quiet enough that only he could hear it clearly, though the room had gone so still you could hear the fluorescent lights hum their electric song. "You have no idea who you're dismissing, Doctor." She turned and walked toward the service elevator, and the mop bucket bumped against her leg with each step. Behind her, whispers started immediately, speculation and pity and schadenfreude mixed together. By the time she reached the basement, the entire hospital would know. By lunch, the story would be that Margaret Walsh had been demoted for some unspecified incompetence, and nobody would dig deeper because nobody wanted to be associated with failure. That was how these things worked. That was how people disappeared. The parking garage smelled like oil and hot asphalt, and Margaret pushed the cart through the concrete levels with mechanical precision. Level 1, oil stains near the elevator bay, scattered trash from someone's lunch. She mopped with the same care she'd once used cleaning surgical instruments, each movement practiced and purposeful. Level 2, a broken beer bottle that someone had swept to the corner, 2 overturned shopping carts, graffiti on the concrete wall that read "Exit or Die." Level 3, nothing but shadows and the occasional car from the overnight shift, parked at odd angles by people too tired to care about lines. 6 hours. She worked 6 hours while her mind tracked time in a different way, the way a trained officer always does. At 0900 hours, Harding would have been deteriorating for 22 hours. At 1200, 25 hours. At 1500, 28 hours. Nobody had volunteered for his care after Dr. Caldwell's announcement yesterday. 10 doctors had refused him, Patel citing liability, Morrison calling it hopeless, Chen pointing to imaging gaps, Rodriguez mentioning resource allocation, Kim citing insurance complications, Bryant referencing facility limitations, and 4 others whose names Margaret hadn't caught, all circling the same idea: this patient was a liability. This patient was too expensive. This patient was too broken. And in that isolation room on the 4th floor, a blind man was lying in a bed, getting sicker by the hour, because the hospital had written him off. Because her presence, her frozen moment of recognition, had made Dr. Caldwell decide she was a threat. So he was isolating her. He was removing her access. He was pushing her down and out before she could talk to anyone, before she could verify what she'd seen on his computer screen, before she could become the witness he was terrified she already was. At 1900 hours, Margaret abandoned the mop bucket in level 1, rode the service elevator back to the 4th floor, and stepped out into the familiar controlled chaos of the night shift. The isolation room was 4 doors down from the nurse's station. She could see it from where she stood, door closed, light on, nobody inside. The night nurse assigned to Harding was at the far end of the corridor, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the glow. Nobody was watching. Margaret slipped into the isolation room and immediately checked the monitors. Oxygen saturation 91% and dropping. Blood pressure elevated. Fever spiking to 103.4. Harding lay in the bed unseeing, his breathing shallow, and his voice when he spoke was barely above a whisper. "Water. Please. Is anyone there?" Margaret held the cup to his lips, and he drank, and when he spoke again it was still the same weak voice, the voice of a man in septic shock. "Thank you. Will you stay?" For a moment. She could have left. She should have left. Going back to Harding's room was walking directly into Dr. Caldwell's trap. But the man in the bed had once called her a traitor in Ramadi, and he'd ordered her court-martialed on false charges, and his word had destroyed her career and sent her underground. 15 years underground. 15 years of night shifts and nobody knowing her name. And now that same man was dying, and he didn't recognize her voice, and no one else in the hospital would save him. Margaret stayed for 20 minutes. She adjusted his she wiped his forehead with a cool cloth, she monitored the oxygen meter as it climbed back to 96% because she knew exactly how to position the cannula to maximize flow. When she left the room, Harding had fallen back into sleep, and she walked back to the basement and picked up the mop again. But at 2100 hours, after finishing level 3, she made her decision. She walked back to the 4th floor and found the charge nurse at the station. "I'll take Harding's overnight," Margaret said quietly. "I know nobody else wants it. I'll manage the full shift." The charge nurse, exhausted, understaffed, grateful, didn't even question it. "God bless you, Margaret." "Thank you." Margaret collected fresh for bags and monitoring supplies, and at 2,200 hours she entered Commander James Harding's isolation room for the second time that day. He was awake, his sightless eyes moving as if trying to track sound. "What's your name?" he asked, his voice still weak but more coherent now. She told him simply, "Margaret." He nodded, already fading back into fevered sleep, and she settled into the chair beside his bed. The faded unit patch was still sewn inside her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs like a secret, and Margaret Walsh, Major Margaret Walsh, though he would never know it, kept watch over the man who'd buried her, as the night deepened and the hospital around them settled into the rhythm of the dying and the saved. The basement parking garage of Oak Creek Memorial smelled like diesel exhaust and industrial cleaner, the kind that burned the back of your throat after an hour. Margaret pushed the mop across the oil-stained concrete in figure eights, each stroke covering ground she'd covered 1,000 times before, but tonight felt different. The bucket water turned grey-brown. She emptied it into the drain. Refilled. Pushed the mop again. 6 hours of janitorial duties. That was the punishment Dr. Caldwell had designed, visible, humiliating, complete. Not fired yet, which meant there was still paperwork, still procedures, still a paper trail he was building. She understood institutional power. She'd survived military bureaucracies that could bury a person alive with nothing but properly filed forms and the right people's silence. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their monotonous song. 10:22 p.m. on the garage wall clock. She'd been down here since 4 p.m., pushing this mop, emptying these bins, watching the shadows grow longer as the evening shift wound down and the night shift took over upstairs. The hospital above her was a living thing, patients wheeled through hallways, monitors beeping their continuous songs, nurses moving with purpose she no longer had permission to claim. She was below, in the basement, doing work that required no credentials, no history, no dangerous knowledge. But her mind wasn't in the basement. Harding was in room for 12, ICU East. She'd checked on him at 7 p.m. during the shift change, moving through corridors with her eyes down, stopping briefly at his doorway while pretending to pass through with her cleaning supplies. His oxygen saturation was 89%. His breathing was shallow, labored, the kind of breathing that meant the shrapnel was still moving, still pressing, still slowly suffocating him from the inside. The morphine drip had him unconscious, mercifully unaware of the deterioration happening in his body. No nurse had been assigned to his room. Caldwell had made sure of that. Voluntary isolation. Punishment without fingerprints. She'd noted his vitals from the hallway, respiratory rate elevated at 24 breaths per minute, color ashen, fingers moving slightly in his sleep as if his body was still trying to escape whatever nightmares plagued a blind man in the dark. Harding had done this to her once. Court-martialed her on false charges, destroyed her career, sent her into a witness protection that looked like a basement mop and 11 years of silence. Now she was watching him deteriorate, and she was not allowed to help him, and the most maddening part was that she wanted to anyway. The mop handle was smooth under her hands, worn down by years of repetition. Her grip adjusted automatically, not too tight, not too loose. Hands moved the way they'd been trained to move, efficient and economical. Muscle memory had nothing to do with mopping. Muscle memory lived deeper than that. It lived in decisions made under fire, in procedures performed while rounds were coming in the absolute certainty that your hands knew what to do before your mind caught up. She mopped past the parking level exit. A doctor walked past at 9:15 p.m., briefcase in one hand, car keys in the other, heading home. She didn't look up. The janitor was invisible. The janitor was supposed to be invisible. At 10:44 p.m., she checked on Harding again, this time using the employee stairwell to access the ICU without passing through the main corridor. His oxygen had dropped to 87%. His breathing was faster now, more labored. The monitors showed the stress, his heart compensating, working harder to move oxygen through a body that wasn't getting enough air. Something was wrong. Something was getting worse, and the clock was running, and no one was coming to help him because Dr. Caldwell had made sure of that. She returned to the basement and mopped until 12:56 a.m. Then she went to the ICU break room, changed into fresh scrubs, and sat in the chair outside Harding's room. The night shift nurse, a young woman named Cassandra, had already been reassigned elsewhere. Caldwell again. Margaret sat in the darkness, listening to the monitors through the door, tracking his vitals like a ship in fog following a lighthouse beam that kept getting dimmer. She was reading a 2-day-old newspaper when the alarm started. Not a warning beep. Not the soft chime of a notification. The oxygen saturation alarm, the one that meant the patient was dying, and it was happening now, and there were minutes at best. Margaret was on her feet before the sound registered fully, muscle memory taking her across the threshold in 2 strides, hands already moving toward the monitor while her eyes assessed the room. Harding's chest was struggling. His skin had gone the color of wet cement. His oxygen saturation read 82% and dropping, 81, 79, 76. His chest was silent. No breath sounds. No air moving. His pleural space was collapsing around itself, and his heart was beating faster and faster, trying to pump blood through lungs that weren't inflating, and he had maybe 4 minutes before cardiac arrest. Tension pneumothorax. The shrapnel had shifted. It had punctured the lung. Air was escaping into his chest cavity, building pressure, crushing his heart. The trachea was deviating. She could see it in his neck. Margaret hit the code button while her other hand was already pulling the phone from the wall. Code blue. She spoke into the receiver with a voice that had no room in it for emotion. We need a surgeon in room for 12, ICU East. Now. Tension pneumothorax, respiratory failure, oxygen dropping to the 70s. The charge nurse came back. Who is this? Night shift coverage. Get Dr. Morrison. 30 seconds of silence. Then, Dr. Morrison's not coming in. He's already assessed the patient. He says comfort measures only. The patient's a non-candidate for surgical intervention. The phone was still in her hand. Harding's oxygen was 74%. His heart rate was 148. His body was being crushed from the inside, and a doctor had already decided he wasn't worth saving. Margaret set the phone down. She didn't waste time calling back. She ran. The staff room locker had been hers for 11 years. The emergency kit inside had been hers for longer, sealed, waterproofed, never opened, never explained. She pulled it out with fingers that didn't shake and opened it on the break room sink. Sterile supplies. Medical tape. Instruments. Medications. Everything a combat surgeon needs when there's no hospital, no backup, and minutes until death. The MRE wrapper was in the pouch, sealed since 2009. She tore it open and pulled out the plastic packaging, waxy and durable. Her hands knew what to do. They'd done this in Fallujah on a Marine whose medic was down. They'd done this in 3 other places that didn't appear in her official records. Improvised chest seal. Needle decompression at the second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. She was back in Harding's room in 90 seconds. His oxygen was at 68%. No time for anesthesia. No time for hesitation. I'm sorry, she said quietly, and meant it for 17 years of distance and 1 moment of necessary violence. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping from his chest cavity, that specific sound, like pressure equalizing, like dying stopping midway through. His oxygen climbed immediately, 72, 78, 82. His breathing loosened. His heart rate dropped from 148 to 134. She taped the makeshift seal in place with hands steady as surgical lasers, and then she saw it on the ultrasound, bone fragments. Pieces of shrapnel, shifted by time and gravity and the deterioration that had been happening for 48 hours while 10 doctors decided he wasn't worth saving. The fragments had to come out. They were puncturing the lung. They would shift again. He would die later if she didn't. She cleaned the wound site with betadine. Pulled instruments from the kit, surgical tweezers, sterile gloves, magnification light clip to the 4-stand. Her fingers moved into the wound with the certainty of someone who'd done this in darkness, in rain, under fire, with nothing but training and the absolute knowledge that saving a life was the only acceptable outcome. The first bone fragment came free. The second. A small piece of shrapnel, maybe 2 centimeters, the kind that would have worked its way deeper eventually, would have caused sepsis, would have killed him slowly instead of quickly. She placed it on sterile gauze and moved to the next fragment. Harding's breathing stabilized. His oxygen climbed to 88, then 92. His heart rate settled into the 110s. His body stopped fighting for air and started healing instead. She finished the procedure at 3:27 a.m. She sutured the wound with 6 stitches using technique that belonged to operating rooms she wasn't supposed to have been in. She disposed of the materials. She cleaned her hands. She stood over the bed and looked at the man sleeping peacefully for the first time in 2 days, and she reached inside her scrubs and touched the faded unit patch sewn into her jacket lining, pressed against her ribs like an accusation. She'd broken cover. She'd used skills she was ordered to bury. She'd saved the man who destroyed her career, and she had no idea what was about to walk through those doors. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she'd do it again. The worst part was that she'd never stop being Major Margaret Walsh, and some part of her never would. Harding's oxygen saturation held at 94%. His vitals normalized. And somewhere above her, in the administrative offices, Dr. Caldwell would be checking his watch, watching the time, wondering if the night shift had produced the complication he'd been hoping for. Margaret settled back into the chair and waited for what came next. Dr. Caldwell arrived at 0320 hours, moving through the pre-dawn corridors with the certainty of a man accustomed to obedience. Someone had paged him about the code, about unauthorized procedures, about a nurse working beyond her scope. His shoes clicked against the tile in a rhythm that sounded like a metronome counting down to reckoning. He entered Harding's room and stopped. The patient was breathing easily. Oxygen saturation at 94%. Sinus rhythm steady on the monitor. The chest seal Margaret had fashioned from the MRE wrapper remained in place, precise and functional, the kind of work that required training the hospital's paperwork said this nurse did not possess. Caldwell's face went white as he read her handwritten notes, detailed, clinical, the notes of someone who had done this before, many times, in places where there was no sterile field and no backup and failure meant someone died in front of you. He picked up the phone without speaking to her. Security. Code yellow in ICU. Immediate response. Margaret stood with her hands at her sides, watching him. She did not tremble. She did not defend herself. She simply waited, the way soldiers wait, present, alert, ready for whatever came next. Caldwell turned to face her, and his voice came out like ice breaking beneath boots. You performed a procedure without authorization. You're not qualified. You've committed. He stopped mid-sentence, understanding flooding across his features that whatever she was not what she appeared. But understanding didn't soften him. It sharpened him. Security will be here in 3 minutes. 2 uniformed guards arrived in 2 minutes 50 seconds. Caldwell pointed at Margaret with the precision of a man executing a carefully planned maneuver. Escort her from the building immediately. She's terminated, effective now. Margaret removed her badge from her lanyard. She held it for 1 moment, feeling its weight, then set it on the bedside table beside the sleeping Commander Harding. The plastic still held her photograph, the timid night shift nurse, the woman who kept her head down and asked no questions and accepted every humiliation with silent grace. She walked between the security guards through the ICU. Past Chen at the nurse's station, who suddenly could not meet her eyes. Past the other nurses who had watched Caldwell hand her a mop bucket 8 hours earlier, who had listened to him call her names. Past the empty break room where she had spent 11 years keeping herself invisible. The service elevator descended with a grinding sound of metal on metal, a noise like a prison door closing. The guards left her at her car in basement parking garage, level 2, and neither of them spoke because there was nothing to say to a woman they'd just escorted from the building. Margaret sat in her decade-old sedan, a grey Honda Civic with 147,000 miles, with the engine dead. She pressed her forehead against the steering wheel. The faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining pressed against her ribs like an accusation. 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines. Dark Horse. The unit that no longer officially knew her name. She had been ordered to disappear after the Ramadi operation was buried. Officially erased. Told never to surface because her testimony had exposed a CIA handler running illegal arms through the battalion supply chain, and she had become a target. The military had given her a new social security number, a new name filed away in a database, a new life constructed in silence. 11 years at Oak Creek Memorial. 11 years as just a nurse. 11 years pretending that Commander James Harding, the man who had court-martialed her to protect his handler, the man whose lies had destroyed her career, didn't exist. She'd saved him anyway. And it had cost her everything again. Above her, in his office on the 4th floor, Dr. Caldwell moved with the precise efficiency of someone committing to a plan. He walked to the Human Resources Department and seized Margaret's personnel file from the cabinet where she had documented 11 years of perfect attendance and 0 complaints. Back in his office, he closed the door and sat at his computer. The screen glowed with the cold light of fluorescent brightness translated through pixels. He opened her file. Began typing. Deleted her advanced cardiac life support certification. Created an incident report dating back 6 months, a fictitious medication error, something minor but persistent. Fabricated a complaint from a physician who had never worked with her. Built a paper trail of incompetence designed to justify her termination before she could reveal what she had seen 3 nights ago on his screen, the pharmaceutical rep kickback spreadsheet, the falsified surgery reports, the invoices that didn't match the procedures he documented. His fingers moved across the keyboard like a musician performing a practiced piece. 1:33 a.m. New document. Patient safety concerns. 2:15 a.m. Fabricated incident report. Medication administration error. 3:33 a.m. Added complaint letter. Scope of practice violation. 4:05 a.m. Final alteration. Deleted her certifications from the system. 4:55 a.m. Save. Send. Cover tracks. The digital timestamp, that tiny marker of when the files were modified, would have told anyone looking carefully that these documents had been created in the past 4 hours. But Caldwell was not thinking about digital timestamps. He was thinking about how to survive the next 48 hours before Margaret could talk to anyone, before she could mention what she'd seen, before the entire house of cards collapsed. He saved the forged documents and leaned back in his chair, satisfied. She was terminated. She was discredited. She was gone. He did not know that the computer system at Oak Creek Memorial maintained automatic backup logs. He did not know that the digital timestamp would become evidence. He did not know that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had been monitoring his activities for 72 hours. In the basement parking garage, Margaret sat motionless. 40 minutes passed. The concrete around her was cold. The light was grey. She pressed her palms against her eyes and felt something like pressure building behind them, not tears, never tears, just the weight of 15 years of carrying secrets, of living as someone else, of choosing to save the man who destroyed her rather than let him die. Her phone was dark in her pocket. No one was calling. No one knew where she was. No one would be coming. The engine stayed dead. The unit patch pressed against her ribs. And somewhere above her in the hospital she had served for 11 years, she was no longer a nurse. She was no longer Margaret Walsh. She was simply gone, again, erased by a man who had no idea that his desperation had just triggered something far larger than his ambitions. The silence of the basement parking garage was absolute. The kind of silence that comes before everything changes. The kind of silence that precedes arrival. The Black Hawk descended through the Raleigh pre-dawn like a predator dropping from altitude, its rotors cutting the silence into pieces. The helipad at Oak Creek Memorial lit up in response, emergency lights painting the tarmac in shades of red and amber, as for Navy SEALs in full tactical gear disembarked before the skids had fully kissed the concrete. They moved with the terrifying fluid precision of apex predators, boots synchronized, purpose radiating off them like heat off summer asphalt. The lead operator, Commander Price, according to the name tape on his chest, carried a file folder the color of classified secrets. Inside the hospital, they didn't announce themselves. They didn't ask permission. They moved through the corridors of Oak Creek Memorial with the kind of authority that made orderlies step aside and security guards suddenly find other duties pressing. Price's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of chain of command, Major Margaret Walsh. Now. The floor supervisor's hands began to tremble. She had no idea why combat-equipped naval officers were walking through her hospital asking for a night shift nurse by rank and full name, but her body understood the answer before her mind caught up. Something was about to break open. The staff scattered. Whispers followed like disturbed birds. Who is she? What did she do? Why are they here? But nobody had answers. Nobody except the woman currently sitting in a basement parking garage 2 floors below, head pressed against a steering wheel that had gone cold hours ago. Commander Price found her there. Tapped on the window of the 12-year-old sedan with a gentleness that seemed impossible from someone built like reinforced concrete. Margaret's head came up slowly, and the moment her eyes met his through the glass, Price saluted. The kind of salute that acknowledged rank, not just courtesy. The kind of salute that said, "We know who you are." She stepped out into the pre-dawn air, still wearing her scrubs, the fabric wrinkled from sitting, her hair coming loose from its braid. Price didn't speak. He simply turned and began walking back toward the hospital. Margaret followed, her composure absolute, her spine straight, though her hands felt like they belonged to someone else, someone who had learned to grip scalpels instead of mops, someone who had trained field medics under fire instead of emptied bedpans in the dark. They entered the ICU from the emergency stairwell. The nursing staff fell silent as the SEALs passed, Margaret moving between them like a ghost becoming solid again. In Harding's room, the light fell in geometric patterns through the blinds, morning beginning somewhere beyond the walls. Commander Harding lay propped on pillows, his sightless eyes moving slightly as he heard the boots on tile, the sound of people entering his space. Price stepped forward and opened the file. His voice was the temperature of winter. Major Margaret Walsh. Navy, 2003 to 2015. Combat Surgical Operations, Ramadi, Anbar Province. You trained 47 field medics under active fire. You saved 47 lives, including Commander Harding's entire unit when their battalion medic was wounded. You were court-martialed on false charges to cover a command failure that wasn't yours. 3 years later, the charges were expunged. You were promoted. Then you were placed in witness protection by direct order of the Pentagon because you testified against the officer who falsified evidence against you. Price let that hang in the air like a held breath. Silver Star. Bronze Star with Valor. 2 Purple Hearts. You've been listed as MIA, missing in action, not missing in person, for 12 years. And this morning, a man who couldn't save you thought he could destroy you again. The door burst open. FBI agents in windbreakers entered with the kind of controlled urgency that meant they'd already made their decision. Behind them came 2 more SEALs with Dr. Caldwell between them, his hands zip-tied, his face the color of old bone. His mouth opened and closed like a fish in drought. The agents carried laptops, printouts, evidence bags containing his personnel files, the digital timestamps from this morning's panic-stricken forgeries glowing like evidence of his own guilt. Richard Caldwell, you're under federal arrest for embezzlement, fraud, and falsification of medical records, one of the agents said, reading the Miranda warning from a card like it was scripture. The other agents were already explaining to the hospital administrator, a woman whose expression had moved from confusion to absolute horror, about the pharmaceutical kickbacks, the surgery reports Caldwell had altered to hide complications, the trail of financial manipulation that had started the moment he decided to sabotage a nurse because she'd seen something on his computer screen he couldn't afford to have exposed. The hospital staff watched in complete silence as Dr. Caldwell was escorted out. His shoes squeaked on the linoleum with each step. Nobody applauded. Nobody spoke. They simply watched him pass the nurse he'd handed a mop bucket to 8 hours earlier, and they understood that something had shifted on its axis. The nurse who pushed that mop, the woman they'd watched get publicly humiliated, reassigned, demoted, fired, was walking free while the doctor who'd orchestrated it all was walking out in handcuffs. In his room, Harding's blind eyes began to leak. His shoulders shook once, controlled, the kind of movement a man learns when he's spent his life not breaking. "I didn't know," he said to the space where Margaret stood. "I swear to God, Margaret, I didn't know until 3 years later when they declassified the investigation. You saved my men. You saved my life in the field. And I signed papers that destroyed you." Margaret's composure was a stone wall. Her hands didn't tremble. Her voice didn't crack. "You were following orders, Commander. I understand chain of command. Will you accept my apology?" His voice broke on the last word. 15 years too late, but I'm asking. Margaret stood at attention, the way she'd been trained, the way her body remembered though she'd tried to forget. "Apology accepted, sir." Commander Price stepped forward and saluted her, a full, formal salute, the kind that meant respect for rank and service. The other 3 SEALs followed. In the morning light streaming through the hospital window, Margaret Walsh stood in her scrubs and returned the salute, and for the first time since Ramadi, she was no longer hiding. She was no longer running. She was simply Major Margaret Walsh, and the entire room held its breath to witness it. 3 months later, Oak Creek Memorial's auditorium filled with staff, administrators, and visitors. Margaret stood in her navy dress uniform, the silver star and bronze star pinned to her chest where they belonged. The hospital board issued a formal apology, words that meant nothing and everything simultaneously. They offered her the position of Director of Trauma Nursing. She declined with quiet dignity and explained that she'd accepted a role training combat medics at Fort Bragg, teaching the next generation of warriors what she'd learned, how to save lives under impossible circumstances, how to carry the weight of choices that will haunt you forever, how to function when everything else breaks. Commander Harding attended, his vision partially restored through surgery at Walter Reed, and publicly thanked her for saving his life twice over. The nursing staff from that night shift stood and applauded. Several wept. Margaret shook hands with the CEO and walked out the same doors she'd been escorted through in handcuffs. For blocks away, in a strip mall parking lot, Dr. Richard Caldwell sat behind a folding table with stacks of insurance pamphlets arranged in front of him like a monument to failure. His medical license was permanently revoked. His practice dissolved. His network of pharmaceutical kickbacks exposed and prosecuted. His hands arranged the pamphlets with a tremor that came from understanding, finally, what it meant to lose everything through his own strategic competence. He didn't look up as Margaret passed on her way to the garage. He simply kept his face carefully turned toward the wall, unable to look at any reflective surface, any mirror, any window that might show him what he'd become. At Fort Bragg, 2 weeks later, Margaret stood before 70 combat medics in a training room that smelled like antiseptic and possibility. The faded unit patch from Ramadi was displayed in a shadow box on her office wall, no longer hidden, no longer a burden. It was simply part of the story now. She began her first lecture the way she'd learned to begin everything, with the truth. "You will face impossible choices under fire," she said, her voice steady and certain. "You will save people who don't deserve it. You will lose people who do. Your hands will remember what your mind tries to forget. And that's okay. That's the cost of giving everything." She paused. The classroom was dead silent. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. Commander Price visited the next month. They reviewed training protocols over coffee, and Price told her Harding had written her a letter, 3 pages, handwritten, the kind of apology that takes years to compose because it has to mean something. Margaret read it alone in her office with the unit patch watching from the wall, and she answered it the way she answered everything, with measured precision and absolute honesty. Her witness protection status was terminated. Her real name was restored. The woman who'd been Major Margaret Walsh for 15 years but lived as a shadow was finally visible again. The closing image is her hands, hands that had held lives together in the sand, hands that had learned to push mops, hands that had extracted bone fragments from a blind man's chest cavity to save him, teaching a young medic how to construct an improvised chest seal from battlefield materials. Her voice carries through the training bay like a transmission to the future. Sometimes the bravest warriors carry stethoscopes, not guns. If this story resonated with you, if you believe in honoring those who serve in silence, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and comment, would you have saved him? What would you have done in Margaret's position? Your comments fuel our commitment to telling stories about the heroes no one sees. Thank you for watching.